Well, good morning to you and welcome to this DSV webinar, the first of a series of 3 which we're going to be running on reimagining business after the COVID-19 virus. What we're really going to be talking about during this webinar is actually how does the supply chain support the business going forward? Because there's been some significant upheaval to businesses and the shock of COVID is really still resonating throughout our organizations. And so it's really how we as supply chain professionals respond to the business challenges, how they get the business model back up and running, and the introduction of possibly new operating models in the business as we move forward. Because although we are currently being wooed by the seduction of normality, we know that normality is going to be far from what it used to be 12 months ago, say. So with the changes in normality, we may need to adapt our business models, etc. And the supply chain is going to have to work closely with the business to ensure that the business going forward is well supported. So we've already felt this shock of COVID, and we've made some very rapid decisions and responses to get us to this point. But we're now at the point, I believe, where we need to start shoring up the supply chain, shoring up our businesses in terms of going forward, in terms of how do we recover our business stability and how do we eventually move into a period of sustainability and growth in terms of our businesses. So during the course of this webinar, please enter questions into the chat screen, and you'll be able to enter those questions, and then we'll look at those. And at the end of this the session, we'll answer those questions for as long as time permits it. But please enter the questions when you think of them. Otherwise, if you get right to the end of the session, then you may have forgotten the question that you wanted to ask. And we will sift out the questions. So if we see a question has been answered during the presentations, we may not answer it, but then you will have the opportunity to engage with your DSV representative for further conversation should you want to do that. So I think in the past, when we've been looking at our supply chains, we've tended to focus more on supply chain efficiency and stability, and really looking at the smooth flow of product as it moves through the supply chain, moving from our suppliers right through to our end customer, and trying to do that in the most cost-effective and efficient way, building good relationships with suppliers, with our channel partners, with our logistics partners in that supply chain, and that really is where our focus has been. And forgive me if I'm a bit harsh, but I feel that we haven't paid enough attention to supply chain risk and redundancy. Now, I know that's a general statement that I'm making, and I know that there are certain industries where huge attention has been placed on supply chain risk and redundancy and resilience, like, for example, the healthcare industry. So forgive my general statement, but I think generally it is an area which has been neglected by a number of industries, which presents us with a real opportunity. That lack of investment in building resiliency is something that we can look at now as we go through this process of reimagining and redesigning supply chains in the new business environment which we're entering into. And let's think about how we could do things differently. And as we rebuild supply chains, really focus on the risk and redundancy elements. At the beginning of the lockdown period in South Africa, DSV ran a very short, brief survey just to sense check the mood of our customers regarding the COVID impact on their business. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see a summary of the top 5 challenges which businesses felt they were facing, and you can read them for yourselves. But essentially, what these are all talking about are 3 key elements. One is cash and cash availability. The second one is inventory and inventory buildup, inventory obsolescence, etc., not having the right inventory available. And then the third one is really about getting new inventory into the country, getting it into their DCs and getting it out to their customers, because we know that it's necessary for many of our customers to constantly be refreshing the inventory to make available new product and merchandise to customers. So those are probably the 3 key things that we need to think about, and they all have key supply chain impacts. So business decisions which are made are going to affect these supply chain issues which we need to be considering going forward. In order to help you understand some of the concepts that Piet's going to share with you today, and in fact the next 2 webinars, we've decided to use a small case study, and we have created a fictitious company called Adventure Sporting Apparel. It has a number of stores. It has 150 stores around South Africa. It has 3 distribution centers. It has an online capability, so online shopping is available from their websites, etc. You can see their product range down there: sporting equipment, camping equipment, etc. All of us are very familiar with this type of store. Target market of adults aged 21 and above, enjoying outdoor and healthy living. So a very South African oriented store, but we feel this will just help us give some examples which will enable you to apply some of the things that Piet's going to be talking about and what we will be talking about in the next 2 webinars, that we do fortnightly. So without any further ado, I'd just like to introduce Piet van Dijk to you. Piet runs our supply chain innovation team in South Africa. Piet has many years of experience in supply chain, both working internally in organizations and for the past few years working as a consultant with DSV customers. And what he's going to be talking through this morning is really a tried and tested approach, which we have been using within DSV for as long as I've been at DSV, which is 18 years. And it is a great approach, and we continue to use it because it works. So I would encourage you to pay attention to what Piet has to say, and to see if there are lessons which you can learn here, which you can apply in your journey moving forward in terms of reimagining and rebuilding your supply chains. So without any further ado, Piet, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Mungo, and thank you everybody for attending today. So Mungo, just to maybe paint a picture of where we're going to be focusing and talking on today, looking at the strategic supply chain alignment model depicted in this picture, typically what you want to do in your company is first of all clearly define your business strategy, considering your customer requirements and so forth. Once that is defined, the next step certainly that we are interested in is defining the supply chain strategy to be aligned with that business strategy. Following that, you can go into more steps, defining and reviewing your supply chain network, your supply chain processes, up to the point where you go on the execution side, looking at your supply chain resources. Now, I think most of us would agree that this is a nice structured approach, but where we find a lot of people get stuck on is the how. How do you actually do those particular steps? And we can delve into quite a lot of detail in each one of these elements. What we want to do in today's session is really talk about the second block, supply chain strategy. And we're going to talk about the different tools and methodologies and ways that we can actually define those supply chain strategies. So the first thing that I can mention is the methodology that we use at DSV is what we call supply chain segmentation. So maybe let's spend a few minutes just talking about what is supply chain segmentation. So this is a picture that is trying to illustrate what is supply chain segmentation and how is it different than, let's say, a traditional approach for a company that wouldn't be using this approach. So on the top picture is, let's say, trying to depict how it would look like if you're not doing supply chain segmentation. So if you have quite a wide range of product groups, and you have also different customer segments, different markets to channel, all of this, but you kind of just try to create a generalized supply chain strategy. I mean, what you would end up doing is, you need to consider all of your different customer groups in terms of, what is their need, in terms of how cost sensitive they are, what is the service levels they are expecting, what kind of agility you need to have. Agility, of course, is your ability to respond quickly to changes in your market environment. And then you would have to basically define a generalized strategy, trying to cover everything with an averaged approach, right? So it is on average the best strategy for your company, which is, it's still better than having no strategy in place, I guess. But, averages has a bit of a problem to it. I mean, what you also generally see with that approach is that companies, they tend to define a lot of KPIs and they really push hard to be the best in all of these KPIs. So typically they want to have the lowest level of inventory, but at the same time, the highest possible service levels and availability. You know, they want to, be quite responsive, and they also want the entire supply chain cost to be under certain budget levels. And what you often find is when you get to situations where certain KPIs might be a little bit, working against each other, and there's no clear prioritization, then it's difficult to decide which route to go. And especially if you're talking to different people in the organization that is responsible for different product groups or different channels to market, etc. So if you compare that to the approach that we use and what we recommend is the supply chain segmentation strategy. What you're attempting to do with the supply chain segmentation is you're attempting to split up your business, if you want to call it, into different supply chains or different supply chain segments, and you're trying to align the supply chain to be in line with your channels to market and your customer segments, all the way from the customer back through all your supply chain processes, all the way to your sourcing strategy upstream. So, I mean, that would give you the best advantage to really have a really customized supply chain for that target market and for that product group. And also, if you define then your priorities and your strategy per supply chain segment and with the different KPIs and priorities of those KPIs, then of course it makes it much easier, and that is definitely the approach that we recommend. I mean, there's also, I mean, there's different ways that I've seen that come, different ways and means and tools that people use to do supply chain segmentation. The one that we use is from the SCOR methodology that I'll be talking about just a little bit shortly. And that's quite a nice quote there at the bottom that says, the future belongs to companies who can match their supply chains to the specific needs of their customer segments, and therefore supply chain segmentation remains one of the key interests of supply chain leaders. So what methodology do we actually use to do that supply chain segmentation? So we use the SCOR methodology. As for those of you that are familiar with it, it's the supply chain operations reference model. It's a very good tool that really attempts to create standardized approach to segmenting and defining your supply chain all the way from a strategic level to the level where you can actually define very standardized KPIs that you can then use to benchmark yourself against your competitors and the industry, etc. So, and in the SCOR methodology, there's a very nice structured approach on how to do supply chain segmentation, which is what we use. So before we actually jump in and try to show you how we do that supply chain segmentation using SCOR, there's one other thing I just wanted to talk to you that you need to be aware of. I'm certain that this is nothing new. When we talk about supply chain configuration, these are kind of the options that are available. If you're just looking at the the top, is the depiction of your supply chain going all the way from product engineering and design through to the tier 2 supplier, tier 1 supplier, then final assembly and configuration, and then supply to your customers. From that point of view, I mean, you can have different supply chain configurations, right? And you can even have different supply chain configurations for different products or product groups, all the way from make to stock, the top green bar, where you basically producing it on forecast, ordering on forecast, stocking it as close as possible to the customer, and really the customer can get the range of products that are in stock at very short notice or immediately, effectively. Or you can pull it a little bit back, where you say you stock the points up to the point where just before final configuration, and then as the customer order comes in, you can do final assembly or configuration before delivering to the customer, still at a fairly short lead time. If you pull it back further, you say, really, I'm really only going to start sourcing the material, my raw materials, when I get the customer order, and that would be the make to order situation, or you can have even engineer to order or customer, where you can really build into the design the customer specific requirements, which at the end of the day, it pushes your inventory all the way back in your supply chain upstream, but that is also the longest possible lead time scenario that you could have. So yeah, this is just on a high level. Again, I'm sure that most people are familiar with these concepts, but just to jog your memory on what it is that we mean when we talk about supply chain configuration. Okay, then Mungo, without further ado, we can maybe show them what we did with the example company that we put together, Adventure Sporting Apparel. So the first thing that we normally start off with when we do the supply chain segmentation with SCOR is we like to draw kind of a scope diagram. The scope diagram, it has, it seems like quite a simple tool. We really want to take a chart. We're going to break it up in 3 pieces, where we on the left hand side, we're going to list your sources of supply. In the middle, we're going to list all the nodes where we that basically exist in your organization. And then on the right hand side, we're going to list all your customer groups or markets to your channels to your customers. And then so that you would do in step 2 is to just draw in all the nodes. And then in step 3, you're going to start drawing the flows that are happening between these nodes. So typically you started off with the main flow, which is the flow of your products and services, and then just to show how that is. And then you could also, if you want to take it further, to say, what we did in this example, you could show the flow of information, etc., which is depicted by maybe the dotted arrows and everything. So it is a good idea to start off with, especially if you have somebody assisting you in kind of a workshop type of environment to do the supply chain segmentation, and they might not be completely familiar with your organization. So it's a good idea to really draw out those flows and to really, it also gives you a very good idea for later on in the process, where you're going to see, possibly through drawing it out like this, you can already identify some opportunities or ask some questions, whether this is the optimal network configuration, etc., etc. So what Mungo and I did is we had this workshop together for the company ASA, and this is really what we came up with. So Mungo gave us a brief introduction of the company earlier on. Here you can see it in a little bit more detail, where you can see they've got 4 sources of supply. We've got several suppliers in the east from China, and then they've got some suppliers coming out of Europe and the US. And then they've also got a handful of local suppliers in South Africa. So how that typically would work is from the imported suppliers, though we've got several options of ports to use in South Africa, they currently import everything through the Durban harbour, which is on the east coast of South Africa. From there, it gets distributed to one of the 3 distribution centres, either in Johannesburg in the north, Cape Town in the south, or Durban in the east coast. And typically the stores that are in that vicinity gets fed from those DCs. So you can see about 70 stores that is in the vicinity of Johannesburg, 40 in the vicinity of Durban, and also 40 in the vicinity of Cape Town. So I guess the only difference would be then the local suppliers, they would just supply directly into these distribution centers. From there, you can see that the stores mainly service the one channel to market, which is customers walking into the stores and purchasing directly in a retail scenario. And then the other scenario is that they've got 2 online channels. One is a business to customer and the other one is business to business. So both of those get fulfilled directly from the distribution centers. So it does not get fulfilled from a store level. And then they also have a channel where they supply directly through their customer base of sports clubs, which is also supplied directly from their distribution centers. So I guess this is a good place to start, to just give you an overview of all the nodes in the supply chain, from the suppliers to the from the first tier suppliers at least to the customers, and the flow of products. It just gives you a really good overview of what's going on, and it also the discussion that happens in this to really asking probing questions. I mean, we could go into quite a lot of detail, but like, how do you actually get the products from Europe to Durban Port? What are the Incoterms you're using? Like, what is your policies on sea freight versus air freight? And all those things are detailed questions and discussions that you could have, with this when you're setting this slide up. From there, I guess that the next step in the supply chain segmentation process would be to draw up this, what we call the supply chain definition matrix. Now, the goal of this, just to maybe refresh your memory, we're wanting to define, ultimately, we want to define separate supply chains or supply chain segments, and then try to see if we can create the priorities or strategy for each one of those supply chain segments, right? So this is a great tool as a next step to take you there. On the left-hand side, what we normally do is we list all the product groups that are on offer. Mungo already went through that. They've got sports equipment, camping equipment, shoes, clothing, tech. We try to just keep it quite simple in this example. It can get quite complicated with a large number of product groups. And then on the top axis in the green, we try to define what is your most predominant customer or market channels, geographically. So we identified 4. 2 of them are, let's say, direct to consumer, and 2 of them are more commercially based. So the direct to consumer, you've got the store sales that's happening in store, and then also individual customers ordering through the internet channel, that would be their B2C channel, and then commercially where they're selling to companies, that would be selling to sports clubs directly, or they've got also commercial B2B ordering platform. Then what we try to do is, as the next logical step, is we just try to fill in these crosses. So this is really just showing which of the product groups are being supplied through which of the channels to market. So interesting, you can see all of the, in this case, all of the product groups are sold through their stores, but they've taken the decision. I think it's not a bad decision. At the moment, they're quite new with their internet channel B2C. They've taken the decision not to right now offer shoes and clothing through that channel. That can be quite challenging when you do a retail like shoes and clothing through the internet. We know from experience, you can see, especially initially, you can see very high levels of returns. People ordering 2-3 different sizes of shoes and like try on the one and then returning the other pairs. So I think they were cautious in their approach. Where you see typically through sports and camping equipment and tech, you see much lower levels of returns through internet channel. But I do believe that this is in their 5-year plan to also start selling the shoes and clothing through their online channel. So that is interesting to note. And then, yeah, through the sports clubs, they really mainly sell sports equipment, clothing and tech. And then the camping equipment, they also sell it commercially to other camping distributors. What the next step is, really we're trying to look at this then, Mungo, and this can be a little bit of a tricky jump to do the next step. You're trying to find those segments that have similar characteristics, similar properties, maybe even similar kind of expectations from a customer point of view on like, which of those supply chain strategies you're going to be applying at the end of the day. So this was a bit of a back and forth, but at the end of the day, this is what we got to. There are 4 different supply chain segments that we identified in this example, and we tried to color code them. So really, typically, these are ones that are quite similar. Interesting to note is many companies, when they start off traditionally with the brick and mortar operations where they have the stores and then they move to also offering the products online channel, they don't really make much of a distinction. They still do the operations in a very similar way, and then they really find it quite challenging with their normal setup and their supply chain, especially on operations in a DC. If you have to pick now all of a sudden, where you're used to shipping pallets out from a DC to your stores, or like bigger shipments, now you have to start, you're getting in customer orders where they want one pair of shoes, or they want specific single products which you have to unpack, and you can't ship full pallets anymore. It can be quite a challenging environment. And also looking at the lead times, I mean, where you might have shipments once a week from the DC to a specific store. I mean, customers certainly, when they order it online, they're not going to be satisfied by only getting a delivery in a week's time. They expect delivery, fairly quickly. I mean, if not same day, then the next day, or maximum within 48 hours, I would expect. These are it's quite a demanding channel. I mean, and the competition is quite high. So we decided that's one of the interesting reasons why we decided to keep the second supply chain segment, which is the internet B2C channel, as a separate supply chain segment. Okay, so from here, I guess we've actually reached the point where we've now identified those 4 separate supply chain segments for this particular example company. Really, the next step would be to then define your supply chain strategy for each one of these supply chains. And the way that we do this, before I jump to that next step, there's a little bit of SCOR, let's say, terminology that we just want to share with you, and that this is really critical for the next step to really try and assign those priorities and strategy per supply chain segment. So according to the SCOR methodology, you've got the possibility of 5 attributes that you can use to prioritize. First attribute is reliability, and that's defined as consistently getting orders right, product meets customer requirements. Okay. Responsiveness is the next one. That is defined as consistent speed of providing product services to the customer. So I guess the key word when you use this responsiveness metrics is the speed to market, right? Which is in this case the focus. The next one is agility. Agility is defined as the ability to respond to changes in external market environment. So all of those 3 attributes are customer-facing attributes or externally facing, and then there are 2 additional attributes that could be used that are a little bit more internally facing. The one is cost, which is the cost associated with managing and operating the supply chain, and then assets or asset management, the effectiveness in managing the supply chain's asset in support of fulfillment. So these are 5 predefined attributes according to the SCOR methodology. Now what we're going to try and do in the next step, which is we're getting close to the end now, is really we have this new matrix where we're going to assign the competitive requirements. We put the 5 possible supply chain metrics, put it on the left-hand side on the scale, and then the 4 supply chain segments that we identified in the first exercise, we're going to put it on the top scale there, as you can see: equipment stores, retail apparel, internet B2C, and commercial. So what we're going to do now, and this is quite often challenging, especially if you do it in a little bit of a workshop environment and you have people from different walks, different departments in your organization in the room. I mean, if you have a finance guy and you have from your supply chain, you might have from procurement people, you might have from customer service, and they might have different views on what should be a priority for a specific supply chain. So it is necessary to go through there and to get to some sort of a consensus and to agree on what is going to be your highest priority, second priority, third priority. So what you are attempting to do in this particular exercise is you have to choose one of the attributes per supply chain that you're going to be superior in. When you say that you want to be superior in that particular attribute, it means that you want to be, you can see there the definition at the bottom right in that block, you want to be in the 90th percentile compared to your competitors globally. So you want to be in the top 10%. So you want to be really world class. I mean, when people talk about you as a company and that particular product range or supply chain, they really would say you are world class, best in class. I mean, there would be few companies that can rival you in that space. So you can only choose one attribute per supply chain segment that you want to be superior in. You can choose then the next 2 is the 2 that you want to be advantage in. Advantage is defined as You want to be in the 70th percentile. So really compared with your competitors, you're in the top 30%. So you're kind of better than average, but not quite superior, right? And then the two remaining ones that you didn't choose as superior advantage, it will default to be the ones that you are going to want to be at parity on, which means you want to be on average compared to your competitors, right? Never do you want to set a strategy where in any of these elements you want to proactively aim to be worse than the average in any one of these elements. So at the very least, worst case scenario, you want to be at least average compared to your competitors. So yeah, there's quite a tricky exercise to go through, and I'll show you what Mungo and I came up with for this example company. And this is the results of what we did, and quite interesting. I mean, there's no right or wrong. You can find at this point that certain of these supply chain segments have got a similar prioritization strategy. In this particular case, there was some ones that got close, but there is no two that are actually exactly the same. And I mean, yeah. So what we looked at. I mean, if you look at the equipment in the stores, for example, I mean, people want to walk into the store. They want to have the product on stock. They want it to be, of a very good quality that they're expecting, and really this is the expectation that they have. Seeing the market channel. I mean, even the responsiveness, which is the time to market, is quite important. Really, that by default, it's a bit of a strange scenario. By default, if you have retail environment, that they will in any case get it. If your reliability in terms of your product availability is there, then really the responsiveness is they can get the product instantly from the store. But yes, this is why we selected for this particular supply chain responsiveness, especially if the product is not in stock in the store and you have to get it then from the DC. The customer, if they look at those products, they're going to want you to, in a very short space of time, either get it to that store or do a direct delivery to them at home. They're not going to be prepared to wait long for that particular products in that supply chain. And then flexibility and agility is also advantage. I mean, that is, again, as we mentioned, your ability to respond to changes in the market environment. You really have to be close to the customers, really have to see what are the trends and what are the needs that are as they're developing in the market. I mean, you especially a lot of the products in that segment are very seasonal, and you always have to manage that and make sure that you have the right products for the right season also in stock. And then the two that come default is the cost and parity, cost and asset management. So again, I mean, the customers in this particular segment in equipment stores, cost would not be their number one, let's say, area of making a decision whether to buy this particular product or not. At least if they can see they're getting value for money and that the products that they're purchasing is at least, on par, comparable to what they can get from your competitors, that should not be too much of an issue. Okay. Yeah, so interesting. So to go through this exercise, and again, I mean, this is something that quite often companies would review periodically to see if this is still the case, and they might decide to change this a little bit, over time as their customer requirements change or as their supply chain environment changes. Okay, and then really just to close it off, I mean, what we've done now here, just to take a step back, we've gone through the process of identifying the different product groups and the market to channels to market. Through that, we identified 4 supply chains or supply chain segments listed on the top. We then looked at the 5 SCOR attributes: reliability, responsiveness, agility, cost, and asset management, and we assign the prioritization to each one of these supply chain segments, right? Now, the next step, so effectively you've done the hard part now in defining your supply chain strategy through segmentation. What is great about SCOR is once you've reached this point, you can look at what are the strategic metrics that are predefined and available through the SCOR model for each one of these attributes. So for example, reliability, the key metric there that you can use is perfect order fulfillment, and it then goes down and it drills it down into the various KPIs that you can use to measure perfect order fulfillment, and then same with all the other attributes. And it even goes further where it defines a lot of practices. So all the practices are grouped in either emerging practices, standard practices, or best practices. So typically if you look at a supply chain segment and you look at the attribute you selected to be superior in, you certainly want to have a look at those best practices and have a look at them and make sure that if you don't have those best practices implemented in your organization supply chain already, certainly that would be a low-hanging fruit to pursue those best practices and implement them. So really, maybe we can just quickly jump back to this slide. If you're not familiar with the SCOR model and methodology and supply chain segmentation, it might have been quite a lot of new concepts. We try to strike a balance to, not go into too much detail, but go into some level of detail to give you an idea of what it would look like if you would try to define your supply chain strategy using supply chain segmentation and specifically the SCOR methodology. So that is certainly the way that we do it at DSV. Now we also normally recommend our customers to do it. But this was all really looking at the bigger picture. Everything is sitting within the second block in this picture, which is really defining your supply chain, making sure that it is in line with your business strategy. I guess once you reach this point and you've gone through that whole process that we just demonstrated, there's still quite a lot of work to do to then make sure that all the other elements in your supply chain is aligned with these various strategies that you define, looking at your network and your processes and your supply chain resources. So really this is just one element that we try to go into a little bit of detail, especially in these trying times. It would probably be advisable if you haven't quite recently done it, to review your supply chain strategy and make sure that it is still relevant and in line with your customer needs and the business strategy. Yeah, and maybe we can just end off the session before we go to questions with the last quote. This is a quote from the ASCM, Association of Supply Chain Management, which says the world of supply chain management is evolving at an extraordinary pace, with innovations progressing from development to established best practices in a matter of months. Yet many of the discoveries that we will define the future of supply chains are still in front of us. So that is quite daunting, I guess, but at the same time, in my view, certainly very exciting. And yeah, let's keep abreast of all these developments and new innovations and see how we can further our supply chains going into the future. Mungo, maybe if I can hand it back over to you and maybe if we can open it up for some questions.
Yes, sure. I know Candice is monitoring the questions as they come in, but there is one question for you, Piet, that I've seen come through. Really, it's would you address all supply chains in one big project, or would you take a phased approach, or would you only do the high value supply chains? What sort of approach might you take as you go down this road?
So I guess, Mungo, there's no right or wrong way. Certainly different people that is quite familiar with supply chain segmentation and SCOR methodology would have different answers to that. Personally, I would like to start off with looking at it holistically, looking at the business in total and then segmenting it. Once you've identified it and segmenting it, you could identify, once you go into more granular level and you want to identify the strategy and the KPIs and the best practices, then certainly you can decide which one of those supply chains you want to do first and do one at a time. So you might say that your most profitable supply chain channel would be first, or you might say that the ones that you have the most strategic customers in could be first. There might be many reasons, but certainly once you get to the lower levels, you can then make a bit of a project out of it and do one of the supply chains at a time, developing the KPIs, best practices, and trying to improve on that.
Okay, thanks.
So Piet, one of the questions that has come through for you is, based on the methodology that you've shown here today, how does this support reimagining business after COVID from a supply chain point of view? Why would this approach be something that we should consider doing now rather than later?
So really, just to maybe go one step back. So the concept of what we showed you here today is nothing new that we thought of now since, let's say, the beginning of the year with COVID. It's been around, like Mungo was saying, for many years. What I would say what changed is, in the past, if you asked me in 2019, how regularly do you need to do this, or when is the right time to do this supply chain segmentation or defining and reviewing your supply chain strategy, I would say you definitely need to do it at least once, as soon as possible if you don't have a strategy in place, and then you have to review it periodically whenever you have either reviewed your business strategy or whether there's a significant change in your supply chain, like maybe there's a shift in your customer requirements. When you add a new channel to market, let's say you add maybe an online selling channel, or you open up into new products, new markets. If there's a significant change like that, I would definitely recommend that you go through this process again and see how that impacts the business overall and perhaps your overall strategy. But you know, what we've seen with what happened with COVID, I mean, it had such a dramatic effect on many companies and their supply chains. Certainly, you need, this is a great time for you to sit and go through this process again and saying, with the new challenges that you're currently seeing, and I mean, like Mungo mentioned, it would be extremely optimistic to believe that, you know, we're just going to weather the storm and within 3 to 5 months, things are going to be back to normal the way it was in 2019. Certainly, you know, we all hope for that, but more realistic scenario is we're going to be in the space where we are right now for many months to come. And even when we go to a post-COVID scenario, you can probably define what we can say as a new normal, where, you know, things aren't completely going to be the way that it used to be. And you have to really go into that level of detail to see what are the shifts that happen in the market, what are your customers actually wanting in the new scenario, and are your supply chains still aligned with it? And I mean, even if it is just really to validate that you are still on the right track, that your supply chains are aligned with your customer expectations, then you know, there's no harm done. But you will probably find quite a lot of opportunities where you can meet your customer expectations even better than you are doing today.
Thanks, Piet. The next question, you used the example of ASA for today's session. Is there any relevance for other supply chains outside of sporting goods apparel? Can this be applied across all different types of supply chains, irrespective of the product and category?
I would say definitely yes. That's the great thing about the SCOR methodology. It is a generic methodology, but you know, it is applicable in all different industries and supply chain segments. So we've certainly just in our experience, you know, we've done it in automotive aftermarket quite a few times. In the healthcare industry, we've done it many times. You know, in retail. So really, we haven't, to be honest, we haven't found one industry where we found that it's not applicable. Of course, you're going to just apply the principles of the supply chain segmentation and SCOR methodology. And even if you go into a specific segment, let's say healthcare, the chances are slim that 2 healthcare companies, you're going to get to the same results, right? This is a very customized approach, and you have to develop this customized strategy for that specific company in that specific industry.
Makes sense. Thanks, Piet. The next question is, for customers or businesses that already have steady supply chains, how can one show that segmentation will add value to the business? And ideally, what type of customer is this best suited for?
Yeah, I don't know, Mungo, if you can also maybe, I know that you've got even a couple of years experience on me using this supply chain segmentation. You're welcome to try and answer that one. I certainly have my opinion on that one.
Yes, my involvement has primarily been with retail customers. But I think that one must avoid trying to adopt a big bang approach. And once one's been through the initial segmentation and identified the supply chains, you then need to hone in on the most important supply chains. When you talk about a steady state supply chain, I guess you're talking about a supply chain which has existed as it does for a long period of time. And I would guess an example of that would be a retailer who is continuously ordering a replenishment of t-shirts and that sort of thing. So a supply chain that has been running for a long time and is really kind of operating in a unique environment. So as an entity. So if you look at that entity, perhaps you don't need to go through the segmentation process again, but it is definitely worth looking at the supply chain attributes. So consider how that supply chain is performing, and then just revisit the attributes. And if perhaps you've chosen responsiveness as the superior attribute, revisit that and say, well, is this really the right attribute to be applying to the supply chain, or should we be looking more at a reliability as the most superior attribute here, and then trying to drive down the cost of running the supply chain. So even if you believe the segmentation is correct and you are viewing that as an independent supply chain, which I think you mean by steady state, you look at the attributes and then see if those are correct for that particular supply chain, and then again look at the metrics and see if you're measuring the right attributes of that supply chain to enable you to drive some continuous improvement initiatives within that supply chain.
Thanks, Mungo. I've got another question for you, Piet. You've referred to it in part, but given the extraordinary number of current unknowns in supply chain right now, number one, is it a good time to do a strategy at all? And two, if so, how long will any given supply chain strategy formulated now remain relevant as opposed to focusing on operational stability?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Candace. Look, we are in uncharted waters here. I don't think any of us in our lifetime has been in a situation like we are now, that what we've seen happening in the last several months with coronavirus, Covid19. My opinion on that is, if you maybe March, April, May, it would have been a little bit premature to make big changes in your supply chain. But I do believe we've reached a point where we've at least reached a certain level of stability, right? And I do believe that this is a good time to start looking at it. Certainly, I don't expect too many, massive changes to the current situation for the next several months. Again, that's a very general assumption, and I mean, we'll have to keep monitoring that and see, review that statement as time goes on. But if you can say that, a big part of the unknowns are kind of behind us, and we found ways, and we see how legislation has changed, we see how our suppliers have reacted, which suppliers have actually made it through this, and the new normal of how they operate. I think it is safe to assume that at the very least we're going to be in the current situation or dealing with similar challenges that we have been dealing for many months to come. 6 to 18 months minimum before we really go to a situation where we can say we passed this pandemic, and then we can redefine what is the new normal at that stage. So yeah, it is a bit of a tricky situation, but I do believe that we have to reassess with what is happening today, and assuming that is going to continue for many months to come, you need to ask yourself the question: are you prepared to change nothing and wait it out for possibly 18 months, or do you want to reposition yourself to be better aligned with the current environment and your supply strategy and your channels to market. You know, if you are assuming that it could be, you know, we might be in the current situation for up to, let's say, 18 months or who knows how long.
Fair enough. Thank you, Piet. Another question's come through that asks for your view on the pros and cons of outsourcing as a way to test the market and learn quickly when moving into a new channel.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's quite a difficult question to answer. I mean, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to outsourcing. I would say that, you know, for an organization, especially a big organization, you do need to ask yourself, what is the actual thing that you are the best at? You know, if it is at a specific, you know, manufacturing specific product, or if you're a distributor, I would say that should be what is your core business, what is your core product offering or the value offering that you have to your customer. I would recommend that you keep that in your own control, right? If you're a typical manufacturer and then you just need to distribute it out and get it sold, probably logistics or supply chain management is not necessarily your primary product offering or value that you can offer the client, and certainly those ones that is your secondary, let's say, thing that you basically really have to do as a necessity. That is something you can look at outsourcing. I mean, there are great companies out there, logistics and supply chain companies that could do it for you. But one would certainly need to look at the pros and cons, do a cost benefit analysis, build a business case, and see if it makes sense. And so again, it's a bit difficult one, not a one size fits all answer to that.
Thanks, Piet. A question that's probably top of minds of a lot of the audience members is, what are the benefits that some of your customers have derived out of applying this approach within their supply chains? Are there tangible benefits that are quantifiable?
Well, I would definitely say so. Like one of the key things that we recommend our customers to do, and many customers in fact do, is to do surveys with their end customers on, you know, how satisfied they are with the service. And certainly what we've seen is, after going through this particular process, supply chain segmentations, redefining the strategies per supply chain, you know, if you did it in the right way, that the ultimate measure is if you start seeing that those customer satisfactions are in fact increasing, and your customers are saying, like, you get what's important to me, and you are focusing, you're realigning your company to put what is important to me as a customer first, and let everything else, you know, still fall in place after that. So certainly we have seen that with customers that's gone through this process, and that is the ultimate measure, that your customer satisfaction and your sales and market share increases.
Thanks, Piet. I think a final question that we have that's come through is, you've referenced the SCOR model quite a bit through your session. How does one gain access to that SCOR model?
So that's also a very good question. So the international body that you normally would do the training for SCOR through was always Apex. So I know that they, in the last 2 years, they've merged, and they're now part of this group that is displayed on the screen, ASCM, the Association of Supply Chain Management. So they offer a lot of courses internationally, also in South Africa, through SAPEX. And they do offer on a regular basis this particular training that's called SCOR-P. So it's the SCOR for professionals, and it is a course that you can do over several weeks or months, and then write the final exam, and then you attain the SCOR certification.
Thanks, Piet. That's all the questions that have come through for today's session. So perhaps I can hand over back to Mungo to close for us today.
Sure, thank you, Candice, and thank you, Piet. There are actually one or two little points I'd like to add to some of the questions. Firstly, the SCOR model was developed in 1996 and has gradually evolved from that version, and the latest version, which has just been released, is version 13. So it's constantly getting refined and kept up to date. And simply by being a member of the Association of Supply Chain Management, which is available via SAPEX in South Africa, and I think is less than 3,000 Rand a year, gives you access to that SCOR model. So it's not a very expensive investment, although I would encourage you to take advantage of some of the training which is available, which Piet referred to, because it's important, if you are going to go down that route, to build some capability within your organization. So that's what I wanted to add on the SCOR side of things. There was a question on strategy, and I think it's important to note that in this environment, strategy cannot be static. Strategy must be fluid. And the business model of the organization, whether it uses S&OP or demand-driven material requirement planning or something like that, will lead you to be making almost monthly adjustments to your strategy as the business changes, and as focus changes and as new opportunities present themselves. So essentially, the most important thing, I think, is alignment between the business and the supply chain. And if the business goes left, the supply chain needs to go left as well, and not go right or continue going straight. There needs to be that alignment. So that's really what I wanted to say about the strategy side of things. And on the outsourcing side, that is an interesting question. I think if you have a really established company, which is complex, and the movement into a new line of business could be disruptive to the existing operation within an organization, might lend itself towards an outsourcing opportunity if you could choose the right partner, with an option maybe to insource and absorb that into your business if traditionally your business likes to do things internally, and you would then bring the learnings back with you. So that is quite an interesting question, and I guess that in this environment, companies, organizations are going to be looking for new opportunities for entering into new lines of business to kind of stimulate the company growth again. So that is quite an interesting question. But I think that there can be learnings, and it can be applied, but within the control of the organization. And the organization that asked that question, I know, is very, very on the ball and exerts a lot of control around its supply chain. So I'm sure if they were to go down that route, they would do it successfully. So just to wrap up, I think we've seen Piet go through basically 4 phases in terms of this exercise for us, really starting with a scope diagram, giving you your bird's eye view of your supply chain, then moving to the supply chain definition matrix, where you actually do your segmentation exercise, then looking at your supply chain attributes, which is where you align your business strategy and your supply chains, and then looking at some metrics at the end of that process. If you would like to learn more about this or engage in further conversation with Piet, myself, or anyone within DSV, just contact your DSV representative and they can put you in touch with us. And we hope this has been helpful, and we hope that you'll be able to chew over it for the next couple of weeks until the next session, which will be running a Wednesday fortnight, when you can in fact raise further questions around these issues. If you like, you'll have the opportunity to do that as well. That one will be focusing more on supply chain visibility and control towers. So I'm sure you'll find that element interesting as well. So just thank you, Piet, for the time you've put into the preparation for today, and for the thoughts you've shared with us. To thank Candice and Claudia for hosting it from a moderation and organizational point of view, and to thank all of you guys for joining us and for spending this hour with us. It's been great to do that, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to spend another hour together in a couple of weeks' time. So go well, stay safe, keep sanitizing, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks a lot.